3 years after my mother died, my father brought Claire and her daughter Ava into Lawson House. He did not introduce them as guests. He brought them in with luggage, lawyers, and a moving crew, as if my mother's portrait had never hung in the front hall, as if her money had not built the company that carried his name. Claire smiled like a woman collecting a debt. Ava cried whenever anyone looked at her too long. I was expected to be gracious. I tried. That was my first mistake. My mother, Margaret Lawson, founded Lawson Harbor Group before my father ever learned how to read a balance sheet. She built ports, freight routes, warehouses, and shipping contracts from nothing but nerve. When she got sick, my father promised her he would protect me. Then she died, and within 6 months he had moved his mistress into her bedroom. I was 19 when Lucas Carter entered my life through a merger alliance between Lawson Harbor Group and Carter Global. He was polished enough for magazine covers, careful enough for investors, and charming enough to make me believe kindness could be real. The Carters needed our ports. My father needed Carter money. I became the engagement ring between two companies. For 3 years, I told myself Lucas was busy when he forgot me. I told myself he was generous when he brought Ava along to dinners and charity events. I told myself he was compassionate when he rushed to comfort her first. Then, the week before our wedding, I finally learned how little I had understood. One evening, Lucas came to my room after another investor dinner. He stood outside my door and said, "Emma, it's late, I know." I opened the door and asked, "Do you need something?" Lucas said, "I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about you. The bridal fitting is tomorrow. My mother and I will pick you up." I said, "All right." He paused, and I knew before he spoke that Ava's name would enter the room with him. Lucas said, "Bring Ava with you. Since the family events are happening together, it will be nice for both of you." I looked at him and understood how many times he had done this. Wherever we went, he found a reason to bring her. I had thought he was being considerate toward my lonely stepsister. He had been making space for the woman he truly wanted. So I smiled and said, "Of course, I'll bring her." That smile was the first door I closed behind me. Welcome back to Wounds and Wonder. If you have ever been made to feel guilty for surviving what someone else did to you, stay with me. Before I tell you how I escaped the man everyone thought I was lucky to marry, like this video, share it with someone who loves a good betrayal story, and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And tell me something simple in the comments. Where are you watching from tonight? For my birthday, Lucas sent a white mare from an exclusive racing line overseas. He met me in the stable and said, "I heard you liked white horses." I touched the mare's mane and said, "You remembered." Lucas smiled as if he had. Then Ava walked in wearing a sapphire necklace I recognized from my own dreams. Months earlier, I had mentioned wanting a custom sapphire piece, something no one else would own. I had thought Lucas was listening to me. Ava touched the pendant at her throat and said, "Lucas made it himself. Can you believe that?" Lucas looked embarrassed and said, "She said she wanted something unique. Only something made by hand felt right." Ava said, "He stayed up for nights sketching it." I remembered the silver cuff links wrapped in my drawer, the gift I had prepared because I thought the necklace was meant for me. I laughed softly and said, "It's beautiful, Ava." The mare startled when Ava moved too close. I grabbed the reins before the animal could bolt. Lucas ran forward, but not to me. He caught Ava by the shoulders and asked, "Are you hurt?" Ava said, "I'm fine. Emma saved me." Only then did Lucas turn to me. He said, "You can't ride alone anymore. It isn't safe." I looked at his hand, still resting on Ava's shoulder, and said, "No, it clearly isn't." That night, I opened the drawer with the cufflinks and found a second envelope tucked beneath them. My mother's attorney, Ms. Morgan, had slipped it there after dinner. Inside was a copy of a board resolution my father had hidden from me. The day after my wedding, my voting shares in Lawson Harbor Group would be transferred into a marital trust managed by Lucas. The engagement was not just a merger, it was a handoff. My father had found a cleaner way to take what my mother left me. The bridal fitting was held at the Carter flagship boutique. The entire store had been closed for us. Cameras waited outside, ready to turn a business marriage into a fairy tale. Inside, 2 gowns stood beneath white light. One was hand-stitched silk, the final masterpiece of the retiring head designer. The other used Carter's newest experimental fabric. It looked expensive, but I had tried it once before, and it had raised welts across my skin within minutes. The designer said, "The silk gown is one of a kind. The second gown is made from our newest textile." Ava and I both said we wanted the first one. Her eyes filled immediately. Ava said, "I'm sorry, Emma, I didn't know you liked it too. Please don't be angry." I asked, "Which acting class are you taking now?" Lucas said sharply, "Emma." Ava lowered her head and said, "Please don't punish me." I said, "When have I ever punished you?" Lucas said, "Enough, she is your sister." That hurt more than I wanted it to. I turned to him and said, "We've been together 3 years, and you still don't know who hurts whom." Lucas pointed at the silk gown and said, "Let Ava have it. The other one suits you better." The old version of me would have argued. She would have asked him to choose her for once. I said, "Fine, Ava can have it." Ava blinked, confused by how easily I surrendered the fight she had prepared. She said, "Thank you, sister." When I came out wearing the experimental gown, the boutique staff praised me. They said I looked elegant. They said I wore beauty naturally. Ava's smile tightened because attention was the one thing she could never share. Then the rash began. Red welts rose across my arms and neck. Lucas went pale and asked the designer, "Why wasn't I told about this fabric?" The designer said, "Ms. Lawson reacted to it during a prior fitting. It was marked in her file." Lucas looked genuinely shocked, and that was almost worse than cruelty. He had ignored me so completely that he did not even know what could hurt me. Ava rushed over and said, "It's my fault. I should have remembered." I covered my arms and said, "There won't be a next time." Lucas said, "The wedding is in 15 days. I'll have the silk gown remade for you." I said, "Thank you, Lucas. I look forward to it." What I looked forward to was leaving. 2 nights later, at a charity gala, a man with a press badge pulled a knife and lunged toward Ava. Lucas froze. I moved first. The blade tore into my side before security dragged the man down. I remember Ava screaming. I remember Lucas shouting her name. I remember falling. When I woke, the room was quiet except for Nora, my maid, crying beside my bed. I asked, "Where is everyone?" Nora said, "You've been unconscious for 2 days. Ms. Ava had a scratch. Your father, Madame Claire, and Mr. Lucas stayed with her all night." Music floated up through the floor. I asked, "Is someone having a party?" Nora said, "Ms. Ava said everyone should celebrate being alive." I laughed and my stitches burned. That pain cleared my head. Before my mother died, she held my hand and made me promise I would take back what was ours and then free myself. At the time, I had thought freedom meant marrying Lucas and leaving Lawson House. Now I knew better. Lucas was not freedom. He was only another locked door. I had 3 days before the wedding, and I needed proof. The charity gala had cameras in every hallway, but my father controlled Lawson security and Lucas controlled Carter security. So I called the one person everyone underestimated, Nora's brother, Ben, a night technician at the gala venue. Ben came through the laundry entrance at midnight with a flash drive hidden inside a box of gauze. He said, "The main footage was wiped, but the backup server kept 30 seconds. In those 30 seconds, Ava saw the attacker before anyone else. She stepped behind Lucas. I stepped in front of both of them. I asked Ben to make 3 copies. He said, "Who do you want them sent to?" I said, "Not yet. Evidence is only useful when it arrives at the worst possible moment." Then Lucas showed me who he really was. I woke in an unused warehouse on the edge of a Carter industrial park, wrists tied to a chair. Lucas stood in front of me like a judge who had already decided the verdict. Lucas said, "Ava has been in a coma since the incident." I said, "She had a scratch." Lucas said, "You always diminish her pain." I asked, "You brought me here. He looked away and said, "You needed to learn consequences." Once I had prayed for Lucas for 3 days in a hospital chapel after a racing accident. Once I had believed him when he said he loved me. Once I had thought he saved me because I mattered. That girl died in the warehouse. Lucas said, "This will hurt. Remember it the next time you think of hurting Ava." I held his gaze as long as I could. When I woke back at Lawson House, Lucas was beside my bed with flowers. He said, "I'm sorry I didn't protect you better, but you understand now, don't you?" I said, "Yes." He thought I meant I understood Ava. I meant I understood him. 2 days before the wedding, Lucas came to me with gifts. He brought deeds to private villas, shares in a racetrack, and the diamond necklace his mother had worn on her wedding day. Lucas asked, "Do you like them?" I said, "They're generous." Lucas said, "I wanted you to know what you mean to me." If I had meant anything to him, he would have known I did not want to be bought. I handed him a sealed envelope and said, "I have a gift for you too, something you've been dreaming of." Lucas asked, "What is it?" I said, "You'll see on the wedding day." He smiled because he thought I loved him. In a way, my gift was love. I was giving him the person he had chosen again and again. I was giving him Ava. That night, I met Ms. Morgan, my mother's oldest friend and the only senior Lawson executive who still remembered whose money built the company. Ms. Morgan said, "Your mother's holdings are back in your name. The ports, the logistics companies, the offshore accounts, and the cash reserves. Everything you asked for." I said, "Send the documents and funds to Ethan Carter's estate." Ms. Morgan asked, "Are you certain about him?" I said, "No, but I'm certain about leaving Lucas." She slid another folder across the table. Ms. Morgan said, "Your mother created a deadlock clause before she died. If your father attempts to transfer your shares without consent, control of Lawson Harbor temporarily passes to you." I stared at the page until the letters steadied. I asked, "Why didn't she tell me?" Ms. Morgan said, "She hoped you would never need it." Ava found me before dawn, already dressed beneath my veil. She looked radiant because she believed she had finally stolen the last thing that belonged to me. Ava said, "Tell me, how does it feel? Lucas will see me under the veil and he'll be thrilled." I said, "Thrilled to death, probably." Ava said, "He loves me. He only kept you because he pitied you." I said, "Then enjoy being loved by a man who calls pity commitment." The Carter wedding convoy arrived at the front entrance. Ethan's quieter car waited by the service gate. Lucas came to collect the woman he believed was me. Ethan's driver came for the woman I had chosen to become. For the first time in years, I chose my own door. I did not go straight to Ethan's estate. That would have been too easy, and by then I had learned that easy exits were usually traps. Ethan's driver took me to a closed Lawson warehouse by the river, where Ms. Morgan was waiting with Ben, 2 accountants, and a retired federal investigator my mother had once helped. The place smelled like dust, salt, and old cardboard. Under the fluorescent lights, my wedding dress looked like something stolen from a different woman's life. Ms. Morgan said, "You have 20 minutes before Lucas realizes the switch." I said, "Then we use 19. We opened my mother's files on a folding table. The hidden share transfers. The medical bills my father had routed through shell companies while my mother was dying. The consulting payments Claire received before she officially joined our household. The warehouse leases Ava had signed using my name. Piece by piece, my family stopped looking like a family and started looking like a crime scene. Ben handed me the flash drive from the Gala footage and said, "I made the copies. One goes to you. One goes to Ms. Morgan. One goes to Helen Carter if anything happens to either of you." I asked, "And the 4th? He smiled and said, "Scheduled email, midnight tomorrow. Every Lawson board member." For the first time in days, I almost laughed. Then my phone lit up with Lucas's name. I let it ring. It rang again. Then Ava called. I answered her instead. Ava said, "Where are you?" I said, "Married." For a second, there was only breathing on the line. Then she whispered, "You think you're clever." I said, "No, I think I'm finished being useful." Ava said, "Lucas is furious, he'll find you." I looked at the documents spread across the table. "Good," I said. "Tell him to bring lawyers." I hung up before she could answer. Ms. Morgan watched me carefully and said, "Your mother would be proud." I wanted those words to comfort me. Instead, they almost broke me. I had spent years being polite inside the house my mother built because I thought endurance honored her. Standing in that warehouse, with blood still pulling at my stitches and a veil pinned crookedly in my hair, I finally understood that my mother had not asked me to endure. She had asked me to survive. That was different. Ethan Carter lived on the coast in a glass estate most people called a prison. He was Lucas's older brother, once considered the stronger successor at Carter Global. After a crash damaged his spine, he withdrew from the company, the press, and nearly everyone who loved him. He received me in a wheelchair, sharp-eyed and unsmiling. Ethan said, "I was told Emma Lawson was coming." I said, "Plans changed." Ethan said, "Clearly." I said, "I am Emma Lawson, Margaret Lawson's daughter." At my mother's name, something in his expression shifted. Ethan said, "Lucas's fiancé." I said, "Former fiancé." Ethan asked, "You chose me over the golden heir." I said, "I chose freedom over a cage with better lighting." That almost made him smile. Ethan asked, "What do you want from me?" I said, "Protection from my father, Ava, and Lucas. In return, I'll help you walk again." Ethan said, "The best specialists in the world failed." I said, "Because you stopped letting them try." His hand tightened on the armrest. Ethan said, "Careful." I said, "Life is short, Ethan. So is pride. Only one of them is worth preserving." For a long moment, I thought he would have me thrown out. Then he called for his attorney. Ethan said, "Draft a contract. She handles my rehabilitation. I handle her safety. She leaves only when I stand again." I said, "Agreed." Ethan said, "You should start calling me Ethan." I said, "Then you should start calling me Emma." For the first month, Ethan thought I was avoiding the work. Every morning, he heard me in the back garden cutting wood, moving frames, installing rails, and arguing with physical therapists over measurements. When he finally demanded to see what I was doing, I wheeled him outside. Parallel bars stood beneath the trees. There were steps, grip stations, soft flooring, and a private rehabilitation course where he could fall without an audience. Ethan asked, "You built this?" I said, "With medical advice." Ethan said, "You think this fixes me?" I said, "No, you're not broken." He stared at the bars, as if they had insulted him. Ethan said, "You know nothing about this." I said, "I know what it feels like to be treated like a burden." Ethan said, "Do not compare your failed engagement to my life." I said, "I won't, but I know what it means when people look at you and see only what they can use." He turned his chair away and said, "I could send you back." I said, "You could, but you won't." Ethan asked, "Why?" I said, "Because you know I'm not here to pity you. I'm here to fight beside you." That was the first day. He stood for 3 seconds. The second day, he stood for 5. The third day, he fell and cursed me so thoroughly, I almost admired him for it. His recovery was not a montage. It was ugly. He hated the sound of the braces. He hated sweating through shirts. He hated the way his hands shook when he reached for the bars. Sometimes he snapped at me. Sometimes I snapped back. One morning, after he fell hard enough to bruise his shoulder, Ethan said, "Why do you keep coming back?" I said, "Because no one came back for me." He was quiet after that. By the end of the second month, he could cross the room with a cane. By the third, he was hiding his progress from me. Nora told me by accident. She said, "He's afraid if you know, you'll leave." That night, I stood outside Ethan's study and heard him dismiss his staff. Ethan said, "I know I can't hide it forever. I just want a little more time with her." I placed my hand over my stomach, and realized I wanted more time too. Lucas came to Ethan's estate during a storm. Ethan refused to let him pass the foyer. Lucas said, "I came for Emma." Ethan said, "My wife is resting." Lucas said, "She was my fiancé." Ethan said, "And you treated her like a shield." Lucas said, "Everyone makes mistakes. I should be the one to fix this." Ethan said, "You don't fix a person by dragging her back to the place that hurt her." Lucas asked, "She told you everything?" Ethan said, "Between husband and wife, there are no secrets." That was not entirely true. Ethan still had not told me he could walk. But Lucas did not need to know that. Lucas said, "I won't give up." Ethan said, "You already did. You only noticed too late." After that, Lucas's world began to crack. He overheard Ava speaking with Claire and my father in a private lounge. Ava said, "Lucas is easy. Say, 'I love you,' look fragile, and he hands over everything." Claire said, "In 3 months, you've gotten more from him than Emma got in 3 years." My father said, "Margaret would have hated this." Ava said, "Margaret is dead because she was weak." Claire said, "And because your father wanted her gone." Ava said, "Emma can live. I want her to feel what I felt as the illegitimate daughter. I took her dress, her jewelry, her mother's company, her fiancé. Lucas is just another thing I took." Lucas finally heard what I had been saying for years. Too late. Lucas threw Ava a birthday gala at Carter Tower and invited every executive, investor, and board ally in the country. Ava thought it was her coronation. It was actually a trap. The same mercenary network that attacked the charity gala planned to strike again. Lucas let the party continue so he could expose them in public and prove he was still in control. Gunfire shattered the glass ceiling. Ava ran. Lucas saw her run. That same night, Ben sent the backup footage to Lucas, Helen Carter, and every Lawson board member. Lucas saw me drag him from the smoke after the first explosion at his racing accident years ago. He saw me take the knife meant for Ava. He learned I had prayed beside his hospital room while Ava posed for sympathy outside. When the last attacker was arrested, Lucas sat alone in the ruined ballroom and said, "Emma saved me." No one answered. No one needed to. Soon after, Helen Carter moved to name Ethan as the next CEO of Carter Global. Lucas panicked, and Ava fed that panic like oxygen. Ava said, "Once you're CEO, Emma will come back. No one refuses the head of Carter Global." Lucas said, "That's not how love works." Ava said, "Then call it power." 3 senior board members joined him. My father offered funds and private security. Their plan was simple: lock down the annual Founders Gala, force Helen to resign publicly, install Lucas as CEO, and remove Ethan in an accident. Lucas agreed to everything except hurting me. That was what he called mercy. Ethan knew before they arrived. The board members had once been loyal to him, and guilt brought them back. He let Lucas believe the coup was still alive, but he made one change no one noticed. He moved the gala feed onto an independent broadcast server owned by Lawson Harbor. At the gala, Lucas struck a glass 3 times with his ring. The doors locked. My father's men moved in. My father said, "Chairwoman Carter, for the stability of the company, you will announce your retirement tonight." Helen stood beside Ethan's wheelchair and asked, "Lucas, is this yours?" Lucas looked at me and said, "I never wanted to hurt anyone." I said, "Then why does everyone near you bleed?" Lucas said, "Ethan used you against me." I said, "No, you lost me all by yourself." My father signaled one of his men toward Ethan. I stepped in front of him. Lucas shouted, "Don't touch her." Ethan took my hand. Then he stood. The room went silent. Not because a miracle had happened, but because the man they had buried alive had walked back into his own life. One board member said, "My family and my shares stand with Ethan Carter." Another said, "Carter Global has one rightful leader." A third said, "We answer to Ethan." Lucas stared at Ethan's legs, then at me. He said, "You set me up." Ethan said, "You set yourself up. I only let you finish the sentence." The independent screens behind us flickered on. The whole room watched Ava confess that she had manipulated Lucas, Claire admit she helped push my mother out, and my father brag that Margaret's company was finally his. Then my mother's deadlock clause appeared beside the confession video. I took the microphone and said, "Effective immediately, Robert Lawson is suspended from Lawson Harbor Group pending investigation. Voting control returns to Margaret Lawson's estate, and I am executing the successor clause." My father said, "You can't do this." I said, "You taught me something useful, Dad. Always read the paperwork before you betray someone." Security disarmed my father's men. Helen announced that Robert Lawson, Claire Lawson, and Ava Lawson would be removed from every Carter-linked enterprise and referred for criminal prosecution. She stripped Lucas of succession rights and all executive authority, effective immediately. Ava screamed until security dragged her out. Lucas did not look at her. He looked at me. I looked away. Afterward, Ethan became CEO. My mother's assets returned to me. The ports, the logistics divisions, the overseas subsidiaries, and the cash reserves that should never have left her control. The investigations did not end in one dramatic night. They never do. People like my father survive by turning consequences into paperwork. He claimed confusion. Claire claimed she had only signed what attorneys placed in front of her. Ava claimed Lucas had manipulated her. Lucas claimed grief had made him unstable. For 6 months, my life became depositions, sealed statements, and board hearings. I sat across from my father in a conference room with no windows while his attorney tried to make me sound bitter instead of robbed. The attorney asked, "Isn't it true you resented your stepsister?" I said, "Yes." He smiled, thinking he had found a crack. I said, "I resented her because she stole from me, lied about me, helped erase my mother, and used tears as a weapon. Resentment is a reasonable response to theft." The stenographer paused for half a second before she kept typing. Ava tried to visit me once before her plea hearing. She arrived at Carter Harbor wearing a cream coat, no makeup, and the soft face she used for men who wanted to rescue her. Ava said, "Emma, please, we were sisters." I said, "No, we lived in the same house." She said, "I was angry, you had everything." I looked past her at the docks my mother had built. I had a dead mother, a father who sold me, and a fiancé who used my body as a shield. If that looked like everything to you, Ava, you were never paying attention. Her face hardened then. The softness vanished. Ava said, "You think Ethan loves you because you're special." I said, "No, I think he loves me because he knows I am free to leave." That was the difference she could not understand. Ava collected people like trophies. Lucas collected loyalty like inheritance. My father collected signatures. Ethan had learned, painfully, that love without choice was only another contract. When Ava left, she was no longer crying. Neither was I. Then Ethan handed me our contract. His signature was already on the release page. Ethan said, "I can walk, you kept your promise." I held the paper and felt the old fear rise in me. Not fear of Ethan. Fear of belonging anywhere so deeply that I forgot how to leave. Ethan said, "I don't want to bind you with a contract. Not because of the child, not because of me, you choose." I touched my stomach and said, "My mother spent her life trapped in Lawson House. It killed her." Ethan said, "I know." I said, "I want to go to Seattle, build something that is mine, raise this child with my name before anyone else's." Ethan's face changed, but he did not reach for me. He said, "Then go." I said, "Ethan." He said, "If I watch you leave, I may ask you to stay. I don't want that to be the last thing you hear from me." I walked to the door. Behind me, Ethan said, "Emma." I stopped. Ethan said, "Come back only if it is because you want to." I said, "I will." 10 years later, the world knew my name without asking whose daughter, fiancé, wife, or victim I had been. Emma Lawson Carter, founder of Lawson Pacific Freight, became one of the most powerful women in international logistics. I built cold chain routes up the West Coast, bought 2 failing docks, turned them profitable, and refused every investor who asked whether my husband had approved the deal. My son knew the sea before he knew boardrooms. He knew his father's voice from weekly calls and handwritten letters. He knew I had left not because love failed, but because freedom mattered. On the 10th anniversary of my departure, my flagship vessel returned to Carter Harbor. Ethan waited at the pier without a wheelchair, without a cane, and without hiding. Our son ran to him first and shouted, "Dad!" Ethan caught him and laughed like a man who had spent 10 years saving the sound. Then he looked at me. Ethan said, "You came back." I said, "I promised I would." Ethan asked, "Are you staying?" I looked at the harbor, the company towers, and the home that had once felt like another kind of cage. Then I looked at Ethan, who had loved me enough to let me leave. There were no cameras on us yet. No board members, no attorneys, no family waiting to turn the moment into strategy. Just the water behind me, the man in front of me, and the life I had built in between. I said, "Yes." He took my hand carefully, as if freedom were something you held without closing your fist. This time, I did not come back as anyone's bride to be claimed. I came back as myself. If this story reached you, tell me in the comments. Would you have gone back to Ethan after 10 years, or would you have stayed away and kept building your own life? Share this with someone who needs a story about choosing yourself, and subscribe to Wounds and Wonder. Come back for the next story.